Liberalizmus vagy halál. Az elmúlt évtizedben a Republikon Intézetben amolyan szállóigévé vált ez a mondat. Az előttünk álló beszélgetésekből talán az is kiderül majd miért. Politikáról, közéletről, aktuális eseményekről és a liberalizmus kérdéseiről beszélgetünk vendégeinkkel. Liberalizmus vagy halál? A Republikon Intézet podcastja.
Welcome everyone. This is Republican Institute's podcast, Liberalism or Death. My name is Máté Hajba, and we are joined today by Tom Palmer, Executive Vice President for Atlas Network. Thank you very much for joining us, Tom, and welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be with you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Today we are going to discuss the illiberal tendencies in Europe, and more specifically in the V4 countries in Hungary, Slovakia, Czechia, and Poland. Tom, you have been traveling all over the world promoting liberty and freedom, and you have a long history with Central Eastern Europe. You have been promoting liberty way before the democratic changes started, and you were trying to set the course of the V4 countries and Central Eastern Europe towards liberty even during communism. Could you tell me and tell us more about this and your relation to the region?
Well, it's been something important to me for a long time. I was raised in a household that didn't like dictatorships, whether they were communist or fascist or Nazi or any other type. And when in the 1980s, many people thought that communism was a permanent fixture of the world. Henry Kissinger and others thought essentially it would be here in another 100 years. And a few people thought it was actually quite brittle. Authoritarian or totalitarian states often seem so strong because they can be very brutal, they dominate the life entirely, but they're brittle, that when they collapse completely and much more rapidly than people think. And what concerned me was not the attempt to accelerate that fall. I thought that was inevitable in a way at some point, but what would come after? And so I went to Austria and worked out of there, and then brought books to the communist countries, Soviet Union, Hungary, Poland, then Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and other countries, because you could do worse than late-stage communism if you were to develop a horror like they got, for instance, in Uzbekistan under Islam Karimov, or Tajikistan with a civil war, over 100,000 people killed in a short period of time. So to reestablish liberal institutions meant teaching law and economics, two very important disciplines. And so I worked with professors to reestablish law faculties. Hungary, in this regard, was one of the least badly off countries. They still taught Roman law, but also economics, and serious economics as it's recognized in the rest of the world. And then I just continued, and then worked in the Arab world, and then the Middle East generally, in Asia, Latin America, and so on. And it's been a lifelong goal to help local people to tie their cause to their own country's traditions, because then they can embrace freedom as their own, not as something that's, of course, the dictators portrayed, something alien. But Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, everyone has they have a history of freedom, and it's important to re-embrace that and energize it and reapply it in each of those countries.
After the fall of communism, Hungary and the region has enjoyed democratic boom for around 20 years, but afterwards illiberal tendencies started to grow. During the 90s, early 90s, support of democracy and free markets were very high. However, after the financial crisis, they were unfortunately much lower than during the 90s. Why do you think that is, and why do you think the whole region started to turn towards illiberalism?
Well, it's a very interesting question. And of course, there are somewhat different stories in each country. Every country has its own path and its own history. But I think that several things happened. One was that we had a global financial crisis, which led to a dip of just a short period of time in output and prosperity that was very quickly recovered. So it's kind of puzzling why something that led to a roughly 2-year decline and that was then recovered to its previous level and then grew has had such a staggering long-term impact. The first point, of course, was it was caused by massive government intervention, the American government in particular, under both Democrats, Republicans, trying to finance the housing market and creating a gigantic bubble that then, because of global financial regulation, infected the entire global financial system. So that's one interesting question. I think it odd that it led this little 2-year blip or decline led to such a huge long-term impact. And I think it was because people picked it up as a propaganda talking point and really made it sort of an enduring feature of political discourse. The second thing, of course, that's happened in more recent years after that was the emergence of the dictatorship of Vladimir Putin in Russia. And the KGB seized the institutions of the state politically, and then through that, all of the armed forces, the interior ministry, and so on, the finance ministry and the tax administration, which was very important. They began then to colonize everything. So they took over all of the media today, and it's been true for some time. There really is no non-state media. All of them are run by the Kremlin. Everything, beginning with all the broadcast media, and now effectively all print media and virtually all internet sources available in Russia. And they took over finance and then made a dictatorship that has spread illiberalism and financed it, certainly throughout Europe, but also America and beyond. Billions and billions and billions of euros put into disinformation campaigns, into financing extreme left-wing political movements and extreme right-wing political movements. Anything that would polarize the society, that would drive people apart, that would cause them to see their neighbors, the people down the street, as enemies. And this is a very clear strategy of the Kremlin. And I think it has really borne fruit. It's been remarkably successful. I should point out that Putin took this very personally when there were demonstrations in Moscow against him. And he thought these were all ginned up by the United States government and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And he vowed, in effect, vengeance, that he would smash and destroy the world of democracies, of peace, of market exchange. And they have poured efforts into political subversion, intellectual subversion of all sorts. It's an enormous activity, and I'm afraid it's had remarkable success. Now, it's also had some setbacks. They lost in Romania and Moldova after expending very substantial resources on that. So it's not inevitable that they will win. They lose as well, just as the invasion of Ukraine. They thought in 3 days, maybe a week, they'd be in Kyiv. Well, surprise, that didn't happen. It didn't stop them from redoubling their efforts, however. And they are truly focused on the elimination of democracy from the world.
You mentioned that Vladimir Putin is basically the source of recent times illiberalism, and Russians are, and the Kremlin specifically, spending billions on promoting their own certain distorted set of values. You think this is an effective tool? Because we have seen that the V4 countries, Central Eastern Europe, who has long suffered under Russian influence as Soviet satellites, there were a lot of anti-Russian sentiments in these countries. And now with the new illiberal trends, we are seeing more and more ties to Russia. There are Orban, for example, in his infamous illiberal speech said that he wants to build an illiberal state modeled upon, among others, Russia. So do you think that thanks to the success of the Russian influence campaign that all these previously anti-Russian countries are now turning to a Russian style or a Russia-light illiberal state?
Yes, I think so. And one thing to keep in mind is how effective they have been at portraying a bizarre cartoon view of what democracy means. We hear this also from Donald Trump, for example, about his political opponents in the United States. He says they want, and I quote, transgender for everyone, close quote. I have no idea what that means. It's a sign of a frankly disordered mind to think such a thing. There's such a tiny percentage of such people in the society, but they've created this enormous scare figure, which is very bizarre, with strange, weird stories, which, to be honest, harken back to the 1930s. They've created this category of immigrant crime. So instead of saying, well, there's a crime, and then ask you, well, who committed it? Was it a person an immigrant or a native-born person? They say it's immigrant crime. It's a new category. And this, of course, has been introduced into the European discourse as well. If you look at the data from the United States, immigrants, whether they're legal, that is to say they've got the visa, or even not, commit crimes at a lower rate than native-born people. But this is not the story that the Trump administration is telling people. They are systematically distorting the information to suggest that there are waves of quote-unquote immigrant crime, and now we have to protect ourselves from that. This has been the weaponization of a lie, frankly, an absolute lie. And we're seeing now similar things in Europe where there are very serious issues about immigration. I'm not downplaying this question about legality, but they have weaponized the issue. And here's the interesting thing. What state has been pushing immigration to Europe? Russia, Russia, Russia. Think about what happened with Syria. It was a very deliberate campaign on the part of the Russian state to bomb Aleppo, to totally destroy the city, to bomb relief columns. 80 trucks coming in from Red Cross and so on were destroyed by Russian planes in order to create a stream of refugees into Europe. This was deliberate, heartless, cruel, brutal, a war crime, but a deliberate political strategy. And then across the border between Belarus and Poland, and then also Finland and Russia, pushing refugees. So they finance flights from Balochistan, from Pakistan, from Africa and elsewhere into Russia. They say, come on, you get a free trip into the European Union. And then they push them. And there are well-documented cases in which people were told if they didn't cross on foot across the Polish border, they would be killed by the Belarusian KGB. And so this has been, again, a deliberate use of immigration to destabilize Europe. They supply the many of the migrants, and then they also supply the narration that we're being invaded. But by whom? Russia.
So in the V4 countries, there are a lot of illiberal tendencies. Hungary was among the first countries to openly declare that Orban wants to build an illiberal state. Do you think that the reason that this region is prominent in its illiberal tendencies and were among the first countries to promote illiberalism is because these four countries and other Central Eastern European countries are on the frontier of Europe, so they are mostly affected or most affected by immigration and their proximity to Russia? Or do you think there are other reasons as well that these countries were early adopters of the Putin-style illiberalism?
Well, it's a deeply interesting question. And again, you have four different narratives, if you will, four different countries with their own unique features. When I recall that when Orban gave that speech, the key one that was delivered in Romania, of all places, he said an illiberal state within the framework of the European Union. And I translate that for people. It means on the basis of the taxes paid by Danish and French and German and Spanish taxpayers. That's exactly what that means. So he has continued to harvest subsidies from the European Union for quite a number of years in order to finance his illiberal state. So that was a very important note to his declaration of an illiberal state within the framework of the European Union, meaning at the expense of Danish taxpayers. it would have been much more difficult to have established that without that support, to just be very frank. Because Hungary, we see now, has been swirling around the drain. They're not doing that well. Economically, it's been outstripped by other European states. And he's turned more and more to other illiberal states, China most notably, for subsidies and backing. And that means that the Hungarian state has become a colony of both Russia and China. It's a very sad thing for me to see. I remember going to Hungary, and it was so wonderful to see the love of freedom and the rediscovery of the great traditions of Hungarian liberalism. Think about Eötvös József, for example, who was a very important figure who brought about liberation of the Jews of Hungary, who brought about the Compromise of 1867 and the restoration of constitutional government to Hungary. To see the rediscovery of that tradition and the possibility of a flourishing free society in Hungary, and now it's been reduced to this low-level illiberal state that is floundering and not even delivering any prosperity to its people. The other cases are a bit different. The region has been awash in nationalism for a long time, and that's easy to play up. Slovaks against Hungarians, that's a sensitive question because Orban wants to exploit the Hungarian minorities abroad. So to be in alliance with the nationalists in Slovakia is a little bit delicate, but somehow they have managed it. The issues of Polish nationalism vis-a-vis Russia. This is why even a Polish nationalist illiberal party finds it difficult to be in alliance with Putin because of the long Russian domination of Poland, which runs against their nationalist movement. Czechia also a bit complicated because of their position and also being sort of torn between these two axes. So the stories vary from country to country. No question about that. I do think that the history of nationalist conflicts in the region has played a role, and illiberal forces always exploit those feelings. It's a natural weapon for them. Yes, they have a history of Russian domination since, of course, the end of the Second World War, certainly. And that means that those are countries that Russian agents feel comfortable operating in. Remember that Putin is fluent in German, having been a KGB thug in the former German Democratic Republic, East Germany. So they know this region quite well in a way that they feel a little bit out of their water in Denmark or Spain or Italy. So that means that those are prime territories for the exploitation by Russian illiberal state.
So you mentioned that there are certain differences between the countries. For example, Poland's relationship to Russia is very much dissimilar to what Orban and Putin have as a relationship. So do you think that you can mention illiberalism as a tying and uniting factor in the V4, or do you think that there are different kinds of illiberalisms going on and illiberal tendencies going on in the Central Eastern European region, or you can just label them as illiberalism, meaning that there can be an illiberal alliance, or there are enough dissimilarities that and there's no political union or any helping factors, or that the leaders of these countries and the illiberal forces in these countries are not helping each other because of the regional and country differences, or it just that they are impacting each other?
It's a complicated matter. If you remember Kaczynski, some years ago, leader of the Law and Justice Party, that almost cemented their power in Poland, but lost in the last general election with the hugest turnout in Polish history, as I recall. He had said, soon we will have Budapest and Warsaw. So it was very clear that they saw at that time a clear alliance between the Fidesz authoritarianism and the Law and Justice authoritarianism. However, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and therefore a greater threat to Poland from Russia, they split. And those two forces took different positions because of the Poles seeing themselves as threatened by Russia, including right-wing Polish illiberals, and then Orban basically obeying the master's call. Let me mention something that was really remarkable to me, and it was, I think, a difficult thing for many Hungarians to swallow this, including his own supporters, when Putin visited Budapest, and he effectively forced Orban to go to the Soviet War Memorial. That was such a clear case of the master yanking the chain on the dog and forcing him to do that, because what was done in 1956 to the Hungarian people was such a shocking, horrifying crime. And the world saw it. You know, to have the regime there with Soviet backing imprison teenagers until their 18th birthday, when they were murdered then by the state, to sit in prison until you're going to turn 18, and then knowing on that day you will die. That regime was so evil, so odious. And remember that Orban got his public presence during that important burial of Nagy Imre, which was a very important moment in contemporary or modern Hungarian history. And then he had to humiliate himself, and just to be frank, humiliate the Hungarian nation entirely by obeying Putin's commands. This was a very clear, as I said, yanking or pulling of the chain on the dog. And it worked. He brought Orban to heel very, very effectively. Now, the question is, can there be an alliance among illiberal movements? There can be, against the common enemy of living together. That is to say, liberalism, which is a philosophy of toleration and coexistence and peace and prosperity through trade and work and productive activity. So they all hate liberalism. What's the next thing that they hate? Each other. And they cannot form an effective long-term peaceful alliance because they hate each other. I remember Slovak nationalists in Slovakia years ago campaigning against the Hungarian minority. And I saw leaflets that showed Hungarians as apes or gorillas or monkeys. And this was so ugly and so despicable. And yet now we see an alliance between Hungarian nationalists and certain kinds of Slovak nationalists. But at the end of the day, they despise and hate each other. The only thing they hate more is the philosophy of coexistence, which is what we call liberalism.
But you mentioned that Hungary and the whole region started off by disliking Russia, to say it mildly, due to the historical grievances and the grave atrocities committed by Russians. And there's been a long journey in terms of distance covered rather than in time from that period to the present time. And even with Orban or with Babiš, they didn't start off as authoritarian or populist politicians. Orban was a prominent liberal figure in the early 90s. Babiš started off as a liberal. And you mentioned that they hate liberalism now and they hate the liberal world order. Do you think they changed, or they were never liberals to begin with?
I can't say about Babiš personally. I met Orban briefly in the old days, and not that we know each other or anything like that, but even then I had an unpleasant impression that he was primarily an opportunistic politician. What mattered to him was power. And in effect, he was driven more by the lust for power than by the love of his country. That's my interpretation. So when he was in alliance with the Magyar Democratic Forum and then turned on them and stabbed them in the back to the point that they just disappeared completely from the political scene, it had been, as I recall, the largest single political party in Hungary. It was modeled on the European Christian democracy model, which was successful in many other countries. It was moderate, centrist, and generally tolerant. And he destroyed them and then recruited an entirely new party base. So expelling or forcing out members of the party who had been founders of it, who did have a liberal vision, and then recruiting a new elite who would be personally dependent on him. It's really remarkable because something similar has been happening in the United States with the Trump movement. They repudiated and expelled the older conservative Republicans of the sort that had been supporters of Ronald Reagan. Donald Trump hates Ronald Reagan with a passion. The very idea of him causes him to become upset, and has recruited instead personal loyalists, people who have no commitment to what were the traditional values of the Republican Party. A free enterprise, a nation of immigrants, a country where anyone could become an American by embracing the Constitution, and so on. All that has been rejected, and instead, these people are just personally loyal to Donald Trump. That path was pioneered early on by Viktor Orban. And so I think that he really did have this mentality at the beginning. I will mention that I knew some of the Fidesz founders years ago, and I was a bit surprised that one of them who stayed with Orban for so long, it was a shock to me that he would abandon those principles. And I asked other people who had left the Fidesz party how that was possible. And they said, well, Orban has information about him. And then when we found out that was exactly the case with this little scandal in Brussels, it became more clear to me this is how Orban operates. He has information about people, he uses it against them, and that's a very effective way of establishing personal control over a party. Personal control. No ideas, no principles, no values, just loyalty to a man.
You mentioned the United States and that Trump is doing somewhat similar things with appointing loyalists and trying to dismantle institutions by having his own people at their top. Do you think there's a similarity between Hungary and the V4 countries and the United States? And if yes, do you think that the illiberal propaganda and lobbying power, for example, in Hungary or from Poland under Kaczynski, who were quite friendly with Trump during his first term, do you think it worked in influencing Trump, or do you think it's just an organic thing that Trump is from the same ideological bunch and he didn't need any nudge from other leaders?
Oh, I think that there are very clear connections. Of course, there are just independent things that follow on the same path. Illiberal authoritarianism has a certain pathway in terms of seeking power. But in the United States case, particularly in the Trump 2, so the second Trump administration, Balázs Orbán has been very close to Vice President Vance. So he's a top advisor in the Orbán government. Same name, but no relationship, no family relationship. But he's a very important thinker within the consolidation of authoritarian and cronyist rule in Hungary. And he has been very close to Vice President Vance and to circles around the White House. And there's been a lot of back and forth. The MCC, the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, which is state-funded think tank, maybe is too pleasant a term, but a propaganda group in Hungary. They got over €1 billion in state subsidies from the Orban government, and that has been grooming and recruiting far-right young people in the United States and across Europe. So I think that there are very clear connections. It's also the case there's a kind of authoritarian handbook. that has been laid out. We see it in Erdogan's regime, Hungary, and of course earlier in Russia. And the very important element of that is to intimidate and then take over the media. And this was done effectively in Hungary, and it is being done in the United States. Look at the way in which media companies are being sued by the president and then forced to basically give him large sums of money for him to spend. It's staggeringly corrupt. And under the American system, if I sue you, particularly if I'm the government, the taxpayer pay all of my legal costs. You pay all of yours, whether you win or lose. That means that they have a huge power against the media. And we've seen them bringing different media companies in line, I should say, with the regime. Similarly with law firms. So they brought cases, they said, we are going to unilaterally say that because your law firm, which has 500 or 1,000 or more lawyers, has stepped up and defended someone who is a political enemy of the president, we will unilaterally, by executive order, strip every lawyer of all their security clearances, so you can't practice certain kinds of law if you're a lawyer in that law firm, make it illegal for anyone in your law firm to enter a government building. Well, that means you can't practice copyright and patent law anymore. We will make sure that no government entity will do any business with your law firm, and any private firm that receives any state contracts will be forbidden to do business with your law firm. Or you can apologize, drop the lawyers who are dealing with defense of someone who is a political enemy of the president, and pay Mr. Trump a lot of money. And that happened. Several law firms told them to go, I'll put it politely, jump in a lake, as we say. They refused and said, we will see you in court. But a number of them folded. It was immensely shameful. But it was a recapitulation of the path that we have seen in the authoritarian states, starting with Russia. Masha Gessen, who's a Russian-born American journalist, so she grew up in Russia, was writing in Russia before she moved to the US. And she said, it's astonishing. As I recall, she said that Trump had done more to move towards dictatorship in 6 months than Putin had accomplished in his first 8 years. So this is an acceleration that we're seeing. And yes, the Russian and Hungarian governments have their fingerprints all over it.
And the US has long been the promoter of the liberal world order and liberal values. This is now changing, as you are mentioning, under Trump. Do you see a global trend that is shifting towards illiberalism, or do we just see the prominent examples of the US and certain Central Eastern European countries? Or are you optimistic that illiberalism has not yet gained so much ground, or do you see it as currently winning and gaining prominence in many countries?
I would say globally the trend has been negative. There has been, if you look at the Freedom House reports on the state of democracy, a general decline. There was a highlight, 2004-2005 period was the high water mark of liberal democracy. So it's been a roughly 20-year decline since that period. The majority of the world's population now live under authoritarian regimes of one sort or another, from full-out dictatorships, monstrous dictatorships such as North Korea, to China, to Russia, and those more mixed regimes where there's some degree of personal liberty, but political monopolization and cronyism and state control of media, such as Hungary. So the trend has been negative. Is it inevitable that it will continue? No, I don't think so. I think it's quite possible that we can see liberal democratic forces regaining momentum. And moreover, there are often very negative consequences to the embrace of this kind of authoritarian collectivism. Hungary has experienced that. Hungarians have not seen rise in their incomes or purchasing power, whereas many other European countries have. Look at the divergence between Poland and Hungary. It's really quite startling. And I think that this may show up in voter behavior, when you still have some elections, and also in general dissatisfaction. The last thing I would mention that I think is very important, because I've been very often in Ukraine, and I work with Ukrainian liberal Democrats there as well, is the stark contrast between the genocidal brutality of the Russian state and the possibility of liberalism is so clear that many Ukrainians who had not perhaps thought very much about it before, who just lived life as it proceeded day by day in what was a pretty corrupt state prior to that time, have made it clear we don't want to live that way anymore. And the example of Russia, which is effectively a totalitarian slave state, in which they expend their soldiers as if there's just an endless supply of them, they don't matter. The Ukrainians call the Russian soldiers sent to kill them single-use soldiers. They're not intended to go back home. And this is becoming clear to Russians also. But what has happened in Ukraine is they said, we don't want to live like that. And there's been such an embrace of pluralism, having a Muslim defense minister, a Jewish president, Orthodox prime minister, and a variety of other religious faiths, Protestants and Catholics within the government. It's a society that is pluralistic, in which people are not afraid every day of the government. And people say, that's what we want. We're willing to fight for that. And when they win against the Russian aggression, I think that there's a very good chance that Ukraine will emerge as an open, free, democratic nation and an example to the others. So this has really polarized the issue very strongly. We have seen what Russian authoritarianism is, and it is genocide, it is rape culture, it is torture, and it is extermination of those who stand in their way. And if Hungarians think, oh, we'll be so lucky Russia won't notice us, I think Hungarians should think more carefully about that. An alliance with such an aggressive state is dangerous to its allies as well.
My final question would be how to fight illiberalism. You mentioned that liberals hate liberalism, and what is the way, what are the best practices for having an antidote to illiberalism, which would be, I guess, or from my perspective, liberal values, how to promote liberal values in illiberal states, and how to help liberalism win ultimately? What do you think are the best ways?
Again, it's going to depend country to country. There's no formula that applies universally, but there are two principles that I think are important, and I think would be likely to play a big role in any response to authoritarianism. And the first is to deny to the authoritarians the claim that they represent the national identity uniquely, that they are representing the true Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Russians, whatever. This is a very important point. They always claim that because, as the populist playbook, Ernesto Laclau, who was an Argentinian post-Marxist, fascist, really awful figure in this way, but he articulated this logic of populism. You create a frontier of exclusion within the society to designate the true people, and the others are the enemy of the people. And so you campaign against the enemy, claiming you are the sole voice of the true people. And they need to lose that. It needs to be denied to them. So in the American context, I encourage Americans to say, we stand for our Constitution, our flag, our tradition of freedom against an alien imposition, which is being pushed on them, of collectivism, statism, of having the government invade states, which is what's happening right now. The federal government causing the Texas National Guard to invade Illinois. This is un-American. And I think it's important. And to say that what is being done by these regimes is un-Hungarian, un-Polish, un-Slovak, un-Czech is important. Deny them their claim that they are the unique bearers of the national identity. The second thing that I think is an important thing to do is to take the time to reach out and listen to the concerns of those people who have, on the margins, supported the ruling parties. So they have a hardcore of people who are attracted by money, by cronyism, by corruption, special government favors, all those things. It's very hard to pull those people away. They, in effect, have lost their moral conscience. They sold themselves for money. Then there's a core around that of people who are so fanatically dedicated to the ideology that they won't really think about it. But that is always a minority of the population, those two groups together. Outside of that, you have the majority who are able to think, and you need to address them in a respectful way. So mocking them or making fun of them is always negative because it drives them back into the hands of the ruling authoritarian party. So one needs to approach such people with the principles of liberalism, which are based on respect. We respect you. And that's why we'd like to urge you to rethink this and then appeal to them to peel away that portion of the population who have been moving in the direction, who are attracted almost magnetically to the authoritarian power, but they can be pulled away from it with appeals to their patriotism, appeals to their reason, properly suited appeals to the national history of the country, and then, of course, the normal electoral principles of this government has failed you, it's not delivering prosperity, they lied to you, they didn't do what they said, and so on. So to appeal to those people who have supported the authoritarian power, but they can be convinced to abandon it. And I think that is where we should be focusing a lot of effort if we want to change the climate of opinion and to make free, open, and prosperous societies possible for everyone.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your insight, and thank you very much for the discussion. This has been Republican Institute's podcast, Liberalism or Death. Thank you very much for joining us, and you can follow our events and our channels in the description, through the links in the description below. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matej.
Ha tetszett a beszélgetés, iratkozz fel a platformon, ahol podcastokat hallgatsz, és kövesd a Republikont a Facebookon, az Instagramon és a YouTube-on is. Ha pedig hozzászólnál a témához, kommentelj bátran, és gyere el a következő konferenciánkra, ahol egy kávé mellett személyesen is beszélgethetünk.